the future of food. 2 weeks ago precisely, I was sitting in New York City at a orientation session at a public school, at a primary school, for my 4-year-old boy. And I was sitting there and the principal came on and talked about the wonderful curriculum. I was sort of sitting there listening to that and I thought, yeah, that's interesting. And then the vice principal came on to introduce the school's new healthy food menu, which I thought, that's interesting. And I was sitting there and out of the corner of my eye, I actually caught a glimpse of the menu itself. And I actually got up out of my chair and I walked across because I wasn't wearing my glasses. And I stood staring at this picture because to me it looked like something from a fast food restaurant. It looks like something you'd see at a McDonald's restaurant or a KFC. And I'm staring at this, and the first thing that came into my mind is that this is not food. This is not food. How can you present this as a healthy choice menu for children? And the other thing to consider is 4-year-olds shouldn't have choice. I mean, you offer them this and they'll eat it, won't they? Because it's full of salt and sugar and fats and all of the things that taste good. But if you look on the right-hand corner, very fine print, they've removed the high fructose corn syrup. What a revelation. I mean, it was never supposed to be there in the first place, so they've taken it out. Hooray. So at this stage, my wife is saying, sit down. Our boy hasn't actually started school yet and we're about to get kicked out. But, you know, I looked at that. The first thing is it's all brown and beige in colour. It's food product. And I think the great irony, so I'm standing up literally as this presentation's happening and took a photo of this. The irony here is that I think that all of the people in New York could be wiped out by a nuclear explosion and this food would probably survive. I mean, it would last 1,000 years, these hamburgers and fries and this junk. Now, to their credit, there's a little salad thing there in the kitchen. But to get the salad or the vegetables, you have to buy the hamburger. Okay, so that's the healthy choice. So I think we really do need to think holistically about the role of food and moving forward in the next decade, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. What is food? This picture was taken in 2011. It was taken around Kansas, which is in the Central Plains area of the United States. It's a beautiful picture. It was taken by NASA from space, and what that really symbolises is the scale of the global industrial agricultural system. This is sorghum farming. It's a monoculture crop. Now, the thing that's interesting for me here is that when we've got a $5 trillion industry, it is the only true industry that touches all of us. I used to be head of marketing for Nokia mobile phones, and we were cheering when we had 40% global market share. But food touches everyone. It's an industry that is all pervasive. So when we have an industry like that, I sense, and I know this as an entrepreneur, there is opportunity for innovation at all levels of the value chain. And there is also significant opportunity for disruption. Now, to put this in context, innovation is a change or it's an improvement to make something better. And that's a good thing. And we heard it yesterday over and over again. And we heard it on the panel today, innovation. But the interesting thing here is disruption. Because disruption, it's not necessarily something that we choose, and it's not always something that we can plan for, and it often comes from places and at times when we least expect it. Now, in the context of sustainability, this won't be there in 30 years. The reason being that this exists in the first place is that it's sucking water from an ancient aquifer, the Galalala. Did I pronounce that correct? Pretty close. And of course, you don't need to be an earth system scientist to understand that if you keep taking water from these aquifers and it's not being replenished, it eventually runs out. So some professors at University of Kansas, I think it was, have said that once this runs out, and they're sort of forecasting 30 to 40 years, it will take 6,000 years of average rainfall to fill it up again. So that is sustainability in action. I mean, this is a very, very big concern, because the west coast of the United States in 30 years as well will be returned back to desert, because it's an industry that has been built on a non-sustainable footing. I've passed around the room some cookies, and I hope you've had a chance to taste them, because a month ago in San Francisco, I came across an innovative small company that is fundamentally challenging how we get our protein. And the product that you've just eaten, some of you, and I can see a couple of you chewing on it right now, 80% of the ingredients of that cookie, which is a brand name, or a biscuit if you come from the UK, is made of cricket flour. I can see some of the Westerners cringing here. There's nothing new about this. I mean, humans have been eating crickets for thousands of years. But the innovation here is putting an interesting source of protein into a product that is more palatable for a Western audience. Now, I don't think this is the solution, but the UN have certainly said that if 20% of the global population started to eat insects, that in itself would move the needle in terms of the impacts of industrial scale agriculture. So it's an innovative little company called Bitty Foods. It's a startup in San Francisco. How did they taste, by the way? So they taste like cookies, right? You know, so what's in it is cricket flour. And by the way, flour is just the name for something that's ground to a dust. I mean, we think of wheat flour, it's just wheat that's ground up. These are roasted, ground up. The additive is honey and some maize, and in the case of the choc chip cookies, if you've got one of those, cacao, raw cacao. So the interesting thing with crickets is that it takes only a gallon of water to produce 1 pound of cricket flour. Now, if we move all the way to the other end and we look at beef, and you've seen this before, you know, it's 2,500 gallons of beef to produce a pound or a couple of pounds of meat product. So on the left we have, I think, an intelligent food source, an option, and on the right we have complete insanity. The average American eats 2.5 times their own weight every year in animal flesh. I was amazed when I heard that statistic. So we need to move to the left increasingly. It's another company I met 6 months ago on the west coast of the US, and they're a bunch of chemists, and they said, our view of food is that it's just a bunch of chemical compounds. And because we're chemists, we can break food down, and we can understand what's in it, and we can also build it up again. So what this organisation, Beyond Meat, has done is they have re-engineered chicken and beef from plant products. They've taken out what they consider to be the bad stuff and left what they consider to be the good nutrients. Now, I've tried this, and it's actually, the weird thing is it tastes like beef and chicken. So it's quite interesting. Now, the question we need to ask is this sort of innovation going to solve global hunger and feed a population of 9 billion? The answer is no. But it's one of many things that we need to be doing. And I think there is a policy angle here, because the problem with beef, and by the way, no one really cringed when I put that up there, but I put the bugs up there, and some of the ladies here went, ooh. So no one really cringes when we look at a picture like this. One of the issues with beef, which has an enormous footprint in terms of water usage and greenhouse gas emissions, is that, to your comment before, the externalities are not priced. So one of the disrupting factors could be in the future that governments say that we need to price beef at its true cost. So a pound of beef going from $25 today to $500 would in some ways solve some of the environmental issues we have around beef production. Now, of course, politically, that's never going to happen in the US. The beef lobby is all powerful. But that could be a disruptor where we have a government that say, let's tax beef. And finally, another company that I met which was taking food to a level that's really not food. They've converted food, or what they call food, into a product called Soylent. Now, if you Google this, someone just called that out, if you Google it, it's the hot food or food-like product in Silicon Valley. And the way they promote their product is that don't waste your time sitting down, preparing meals and eating, because you can tip this powder, add water, put it into a blender, and you simply drink it. And in 3 minutes, you've had your food. Now that is, seriously, this is a little weird, right? So we also need to look at food in the context of the social role food plays. When we start to remove the connection with growing food and preparing food, I think that we impact the ability of our local communities to be resilient. So this is not the solution. It's interesting if you need a quick sort of burst of nutrients, but probably not the solution. So with that, I'd like to conclude and invite the panellists onto stage with me now to discuss the future of food. So please, could you come and join me on stage? Thanks, guys. Thank you. Thank you. How are the cookies, by the way? Good. Yeah, pretty good. Right, I'd like to introduce the final panel for the 1.5 day proceedings. The topic, quite broadly, as I've just introduced, is the future of food, and I've given some of my perspectives around innovation that's happening and disruption. Todd Gimble, who was supposed to be facilitating this panel from Landmark Asia, is quite ill, so we wish him the best of luck with his recovery. He's in hospital at the moment. The panel, as we were meeting out there, we're having quite a debate as to who was to go first, and so we agreed that the Vietnamese government would, or the government representative at least, would kick off. So we'll run it like the other panels. The panellists will introduce themselves, spend 2 or 3 minutes to frame up the context of what they are doing in their respective organisations, and then we'll have some questions, and we'll also take some questions from the audience. So.
Hello, can you hear me? Good morning, everybody. I was introduced as a government representative, but I am not government officer anymore. I just retired weeks ago.
Oh, congratulations. Yeah, well done.
Thank you.
Former government.
I work in an organization named IPSAP. That is, we only think our organization is the think tank of the Ministry of Agriculture. So we report directly to the minister, to different director of different departments. the Ministry of Agriculture is cover very vast area from rural development to agriculture development. And in agriculture, it touches to crops, animal husbandry, fisheries, etc. But since 70% of the total population in Vietnam still live in rural area, so our research institute is also support for the another body like government office, party office, National Assembly office, and interesting enough is that we also feel that we representative for farmers and even for private sector. So our research institute work from policy research. We evaluate the impact of policy of different stakeholders, but we also do market research and support for different stakeholder in investment in agriculture. So we work like semi-independent with government. That is why now I am out of the system, but I still feel the same way we worked before. When we see the story that you just mentioned about the food, I feeling that I don't know how to say in this panel, because we start with the first step in the food chain in the agriculture area. It's quite far away until the table of the customer who sit in the US or in Western area. But you see, in Vietnam, half of our agricultural production is for export. Farmer produce 2 rice of bowls. Bowl of rice is 1 bowl for export.
Yep.
For coffee or pepper, 90%. So everybody here is produced for the food system. So later on we will discuss that in the point of view of the producer. Thank you.
That's a good introduction. I mean, we heard about people eating rice as well. I mean, that's a very logical thing to do. And from a health perspective, is to have rice twice or 3 times a day. Nathan, I think we agreed that you'd probably go next and representing the World Bank. So would you like to introduce your role with that organisation and some perspectives on the future of food?
All right, thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nathan Belletti. I manage the World Bank's programs in agriculture and food in East Asia and the Pacific region, based in the lovely city of Hanoi here. First, I just want to say that, you know, from the World Bank's perspective, we have a very clear vision that by 2030, as part of the SDGs, that we will live in a world that is able to feed every person every day with safe and sufficient and nutritious food. That's our goal. What does that mean in terms of translating to concrete actions on the ground? Well, first of all, 78% of the world's poor are living in rural areas, and we believe the majority of those are involved in some form or another in the food system, which means that we cannot be able to achieve this goal without actively engaging them. The second is that we believe that government alone will not be able to deliver on this agenda, but government's going to have to be an enabler, facilitator of that. But that there's going to have to be a robust linkage with the private sector to develop and achieve this. So we're actively seeing how to facilitate that linkage and supporting that enabling environment that government would place in support of the private sector. And the last is, of course, sustainability. Climate smart agriculture is not just a concept, it's got to be a reality. It's got to be a daily existence in everything that we do going forward. I think we've seen enough evidence over the last couple of days, and with the changing situation globally, I think we're going to have to intensify our agricultural research efforts, I think we're going to have to be much more judicious on our use of public expenditure, of private capital, in how we produce food sustainably. So that's going to require sort of collective action on the part of all of us. So we are very keen to work on these things together with everyone. A couple of trends that are noteworthy that I think that from our side we're actively looking at, particularly in the context of Asia, is a change in demand patterns. We project that, just to give you an example, that by 2030 the demand change in Asia alone would be like almost 30%, 35% for dairy and meats, whereas staples, rice, etc., will likely not increase much more than 5 to 7%. So what does that mean? We're going to have to adapt to these changing demand requirements. In certain countries, such as Indonesia, we see that the volume of business in the food system will almost triple on vegetables and fruits, on the horticultural crops. So these are all trends that we all have to be very conscientious of and engaged on. The last point I wanted to just make is on food safety. I think that food safety has to be a very core part of everything that we do. We're very excited about a joint program which is called the Global Food Safety Partnership, which has brought together the public sector, the private sector, academia together to think through how we can work on these issues collectively across the board. And several of the panel members here are organizations, are active members of that, and we really hope that this platform will serve as a catalyst for sending out the right messages going forward.
Thanks, Nathan. So with climate change as a backdrop and resource scarcity, can we feed 9 billion people, 10 billion people, whatever the number is, in 2050?
We certainly believe we can. We certainly believe that we can, but it's going to take a lot of collective effort, as I said. You know, if you have yield differentials that are almost 200, 300, 400% just within East Asia on a simple thing like rice, for example.
Yeah.
If we can close that gap in a sustainable manner, we think that it can be achieved.
Yeah, thank you. Matt, would you like to, or have I upset the...
I don't mind going next. So we're changing the order a bit.
No, that's okay. Well, Tina, yeah, would you like to go?
I'm very happy to go next.
Sure, yeah.
Okay. My name is Tina Lawton. I work for Syngenta, and I'm the Regional Director for Asia Pacific, so thank you very much for this opportunity. Like Nathan, we believe that farmers, large and small, can produce enough food to feed a growing population and can do so in a sustainable way, which is protecting their resources for future generations. But we also acknowledge that this is an extremely complex task, and picking up on the theme from the panel this morning, it's really going to take multi-stakeholder partnerships in order to make a scalable and appreciable difference. So maybe I can reflect a little bit on what is Syngenta doing and how is it working with others. So first of all, if I reflect, the first thing that we believe is critically important is that all farmers, particularly smallholder farmers, have access to great technologies and they know how to use them in order to get the best results. If I reflect, only 3 weeks ago, I was standing in a field in Medan, rice growing, in one of Syngenta's learning centers. Now these are field demonstration plots. Broadly, the width of this white backdrop that we have here as a panel, and moving as far back as the back of this room. Now the plot's divided into 4 quarters, and within those quarters we look at each of the critical growth stages of rice, of which there are 4. Within each of those quarters we look at farmer practice versus Syngenta practice, and we provide a practical way of demonstrating how to use our technologies and good agronomic practice, which includes nutrition and water management, in order to grow the crop and realize the higher yields that are needed in order to get greater productivity out of our existing land. Syngenta's had more than 3.1 million farmers go through plots like this across Asia Pacific. And we're deliberately inviting lead farmers to these plots, as well as working with agricultural extension services, so that we can get a multiplier effect, and in turn those farmers can go back to their communities and share with other farmers how to get a better result by just using the right product at the right time with good agronomy to get the best result. So that's the first thing we can do. But we recognize that that is only a limited impact that we can have. So the next critical platform of how we're approaching this challenge is through multi-stakeholder dialogues and through multi-stakeholder partnerships. We had a great conversation yesterday about the work we're doing in coffee here in Vietnam, influencing and working with more than 6,500 growers, as well as the government in terms of how we shape the policy and are proactive and have a positive environment in which this collaboration can operate. The extension service, as well as the Central University and WASI, looking at what's the challenge to be solved. What role can Syngenta play, again using this very practical, seeing is believing, practical education for coffee growers to help them get better yields, and then partnering with Nestle in order to ensure that once they have a better yield, they have a secure market where they can sell that product and get a fair price for it. This is something we're already doing across a number of countries, also working with Grow Asia to ensure that the right governance and the right measures are in place to see that we are making a sustainable difference. So the third area, what are we doing differently? We really believe that we need to change how we work with communities, and that is really embodied in our Good Growth Plan. Here we have 6 commitments in terms of how we are going to operate in the communities which we serve and how we as a business are going to run, so that we can truly say that we are standing there and we are operating in a sustainable fashion. Now within those 6 commitments, there are 3 that are really important to us here in Asia Pacific. How can we raise the yields of critical crops by more than 20% in a resource neutral way? So getting more from existing inputs, number 1. Number 2, how can we work with smallholders, 20 million smallholders, to increase their yields by more than 50%, again in a resource neutral way, by 2020. And finally, how can we ensure that they are safe in how they are using these products, how they are storing these products, and that workers involved are similarly safe in their use. These are 3 of the pillars within the Good Growth Plan that we are actively pursuing in Asia Pacific, because this is where we believe we can make the biggest difference. So these are some of the things that we're doing in Syngenta, and together with partners, that we believe will allow farmers, large and small, to meet the food challenge of the future. Thank you.
You know, that's very impressive. Just to pick up on the 3 million farmers, how do you engage? Is there a technology platform that you work? Is it mobile technology? How do you do that?
Yeah, we work at the moment through our retail partners.
So
we ask them to identify who are the lead farmers that they know, that they are serving. We then work together as a retailer to invite them to participate in our Syngenta Learning Centres or our farmer demonstration plots. We also invite the agricultural extension service of the government in which that we are operating. And together then we find that we can have a multiplier effect in education within the rural communities.
Absolutely. Do you see a role for technology, for mobility, and to use mobile technology to educate?
Absolutely. So we have at the moment a couple of pilots where we're looking at how can we enable education through technology. We realize that it needs to be very visual, so video and pictures and storytelling are really, really important. And how can we empower lead farmers to tell their story in their experience, in their own words, which is very much believable by farmers in the communities in which they operate. So it's an area we're exploring, but we absolutely know we need to do more. And again, through partnerships, we believe this can unlock a great opportunity for everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you. Matt, shall we, we've got a system in place now.
So good afternoon. My name is Matt Kovac and I'm the Policy Director with Food Industry Asia. We're an association based in Singapore, and we represent some of the biggest food companies in the world, some of the biggest multinationals, many of the big brands that you'll be familiar with, from Coke to PepsiCo to Mondelez and Mars, McDonald's and Yum, to name just a few. As an association only representing these companies in Asia, We focus very much on three core pillars. One of those pillars is food safety, which Nathan mentioned earlier, and we're working with the GFSP on food safety initiatives. Number two would also be on harmonization, and that's very much focused on Southeast Asia and the ASEAN economic community and harmonizing certain standards to facilitate trade, certainly for the food sector. And the next pillar is probably a little bit more the controversial one, and I'd like to thank Tony for his presentation earlier, and I would like to address some things in that. And that's based on health and nutrition. And one of the biggest debates around that is non-communicable diseases or chronic diseases and obesity. There are, I won't talk extensively or in depth about all three of those pillars, but perhaps I'll focus on health and nutrition and food safety first. As a father of three myself, I'm quite concerned, what my children eat and what they consume while they're at school. And I think the food industry is actually in the process now of stepping up and looking at how it would do outdoor and indoor marketing in schools. Certainly in terms of how it provides more balanced food that it offers, in terms of different product offerings in schools, and some companies actually considering not to offer any of their products in schools, and that's a voluntary agreement that they might take forward, and that's in discussion at the moment. Some of the other initiatives on obesity that my companies that I represent are doing are looking at product reformulation, and that's working with academia as well as with NGOs and governments on how they would go about product reformulation and introducing the appropriate regulations to help them do that, as well as reducing the amount of marketing in general they do to children. And many of the companies I represent have put a global agreement in place not to market directly to children under 12 years old. And also looking at other measures such as the energy in and energy out situation, which is trying to encourage and doing some public-private partnerships with academia and government on encouraging healthier lifestyles. So those are some of the broad things on health and nutrition. And on food safety, I think if we look forward in terms of the future of food safety is probably one of the primary importance areas for many of the food companies. There's been many scandals, certainly globally and also in Asia, concerning food safety. And it's absolutely imperative that you take a whole supply chain approach to this, and looking at sort of products from farm all the way down to table as well. And I think there are various initiatives that the companies are involved with in some countries in the region, where they're looking at how they would trace products from the farm all the way to the retailer. And so that people can use a mobile or a technology to be able to see what type of food, where it's sourced, where it comes from, so that they're able to track that. And I think those are some of the areas that we focus on. So, and as to Tony's concern in his presentation as well, it's sometimes it's easy to point a finger at the food companies and say they're to blame for this. But I think perhaps you want to have a word with the principal about their sort of policy in their schools as well. It's not just the food companies. There are policies in place, or your school's rules in place that perhaps you want to talk to them about.
Absolutely. I'll take my kid out of that school, I think. Thank you, Matt. Okay, Regina, would you like to say a few words?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Regina Manchpana, and I'm heading the Singapore office of the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, an NGO, also called GAIN. And it's interesting to hear the points that were raised in the presentations, because we are actually representing an organization that deals with the population, the consumers who actually have very little purchasing power. We are looking at the poorer segments of the population. Our vision is to really bring nutritious foods to those in need at affordable prices, which is a big challenge. So, and currently we are reaching about 900 million people with more nutritious foods. So the title of the future of the food, I would say, and Nathan, you have already mentioned a little bit to this, I think it's very much determined by demographic shifts. We know that in the next coming years, more than 50% of the world population will actually live in urban areas. With this comes, of course, the pressure onto the food supply chain. How can we actually support all those people living in the urban areas? And in addition, where our organization comes in is we are looking at the poor segment. So that means we are not looking at the upper middle class and the richer segments who can choose between a very niche product or who can choose, you know, what they really want to buy. We are looking at consumers that are living at $3, $4, $5 a day, $2 a day, and it's very difficult for them to actually make nutrition sound decisions because they have little choices. Purchasing power is actually too small so that they can go out and have a nutritious, diversified diet and not only one or two colors, like Tony pointed out. We know that we need different colors in our plate. So that's where our organization comes in, and the future for the food will definitely lie out of circumstances in more packaged food, because we have to transport it from the point of production into the consumer point. So how can we do that? So I think the packaging comes in here quite a lot, as well the issue around processed foods, because we are processing the foods, and there is of course also a big responsibility for the respective food and beverage industries who are producing the food. I would also say that the poverty issue is still there, and I don't want to say that my heart jumped when I heard the previous panel, but it was the only panel that actually mentioned that particularly in Asia we have still huge problems of malnutrition, be it undernutrition or obesity. And just to highlight, in the Southeast Asian region we have high percentages of stunting, which is a long deprivation of optimal nutrition. Stunting is a child that is too short for its age. But it's not only that the height that is so critical, it's really the long-lasting problems in terms of reduced optimal development, but also when being an adult and you have been stunted as a child, you are more prone to less earn, you are more prone to be less productive, you're prone to be more sick, and you're also prone to be more obese. So that means in Asia, and that's why it has linkages to our panel here, the future for the food, we really have to look how we can actually maneuver in an environment where we have to consider an obesity pandemic, diabetes pandemic, and we still have undernutrition, wasting, and stunting. And just to finalize, my last word is, I would say that the future for food lies in nutrient-dense foods. And I can explain later what this means, but I think that's the key. It needs to be nutrient-dense food.
Thanks, Regina. Maybe pick up on that point now. I mean, that's an interesting topic. So nutrient-dense food. Is that Soylent, as I presented, or is it a hamburger? What's nutrient-dense food?
Well, actually, it's not such a new term. I mean, what we want to bring across with nutrient-dense or nutrient density, it means that actually you have the food in a certain combination between protein, fat, carbohydrates, vitamins, and minerals. And why we say nutrient-dense, it's very important because here we talked a lot yesterday and today about food security, and we have to improve, the production. But what does this mean? Does it mean, particularly in our working group on rice, does it mean that we want to just produce more quantity? Or do we also look at the quality, which means the diversity of the different foods that we are producing, so that the end consumer can actually have diversified plate? So the nutrient density comes in when we want to have the right composition of the food, and we do not want to have only one plate of rice, because that is only to fill our stomachs, but that's not nutritious food. So what we would like to see is a fourth rice and the rest some other proteins, some meat, fruits, vegetables, etc. And that's nutrient dense. And maybe just to let me add on, the most critical nutrient density requirements is really when we talk about little children, when we talk about toddlers. After 6 months of exclusive breastfeeding, you have to complement with food the breast milk until 2 years. And in that period, 6 to 2 years of age, it's absolutely critical that we have the right nutrient-dense food that we give to a small infant, because the stomach has a certain volume and cannot, eat too much. So that's where the nutrient is.
Thanks, Regina. We've got a lot of questions that have come through from the audience. We have a technical problem which I can resolve. I don't have the passcode for the iPad, so if someone could tell me what the secret code is, you can yell it out. You can tell the audience. I've tried 4 zeros and all of the obvious things. Rosie, could you help unlock? No. If not, we'll go to the microphone. Here it comes now. I think there's an interesting book by Michael Pollan, which most of us have probably read, and he says that the future of food really is things that your grandmother would recognise as food. So perhaps the future of food, is growing things, and also not just growing, but getting back to cooking. When I moved to New York 3 months ago, my next door neighbour knocked on the door and said, "Are you cooking? I can smell something. It's quite amazing." Thank you. And, it wasn't cooking anything to flash. It was frying some onions and, it had a nice aroma to it. But I said to this lady who'd been living in the building for 30 years, I said, "What do? You don't cook?" She says, "No one cooks here. We all order food in, and there is a procession every evening between 5:30 and 9 in the evening of deliveries on bicycles, where the food is delivered, it's packaged in plastic containers, it's reheated, it's eaten quickly, and then it's dumped. And the next morning there is a pile of garbage that's stacked to the roof of plastic containers." So I think getting back to cooking is also something interesting in terms of how we respect food. Now, the questions that have come in here. What are the concrete actions of WB? What's WB? Excuse me. We've got the World Bank. This is for you, Nathan. From now to 2030 for ensuring food safety, specifically in Vietnam.
A lot of things.
Let's perhaps focus on the top 3. So what are the concrete actions that the WB from now to 2030 can do to ensure food safety in Vietnam?
So, if I could answer that question maybe at 3 p.m. or 4 p.m., that would be good, because we're actually having a meeting with the Deputy Prime Minister at 2 p.m. today with sort of the lead development partners on food safety in Vietnam. This is obviously a huge issue in Vietnam, primarily because Dr. Son can correct me, but I think almost 80% of food production is done in small farms. It's not through what we call commercial or large-scale retail outfits. So this is a particularly serious concern in terms of management of the food system, putting in place enforcement mechanisms. So we're initiating a discussion. The government is keen to start a discussion with all the key sort of development partners in this field to understand what sorts of ideas that we may have, what are the key issues that they're facing between the different agencies in the country that are monitoring this. But I think there's clearly a recognition that this has to be a top priority, and not just here. I'm sure others can talk about this as well. But throughout Asia, this is a top priority in many countries. We've had explicit requests from the Chinese government. We're working to help establish the China Food and Drug Administration in Indonesia with BPOM. This is because of the dense urbanization and the critical need for the amounts of foods that are required. It's a serious issue. So it's everything from training of technicians to laboratories to getting the enabling environment right. So these are the various actions. And what we continue to say, and why I mentioned this opportunity that the GFSP, the Global Food Safety Program, provides, is that no single government, no single donor will be able to deal with this. It needs concerted action by all of us collectively: civil society, private sector, government, bilaterals. And I couldn't emphasize that enough.
And it's complex, incredibly complex. Right. In what ways are global diets likely to change over the next 50 years? is there an ideal sustainable pattern of consumption? So in what ways are global diets likely to change in the next 50 years? And is there an ideal pattern of sustainable consumption? Regina, would you like to?
I can make a try. Well, as I said, I think demographic shifts are taking place and they are unstoppable because this is just evolution. We see the middle class growing, we see different demand for foods, and we also see that we have a lot of people, of course, working, which is also the pressure on more convenience food. So I think there will be a change to, I hope, to maybe having a bit more diversified food, less only staples, and I think in some of the countries we see that, but unfortunately then it's replaced with too much of meat intake or then too much of dairy intake. So I think the trends are that, and that's the statistics that are telling this us, the trends are really that animal protein consumption is increasing, some cereal consumption is decreasing. Unfortunately, what is lacking is more shift towards vegetable consumption and fruits. I think Vietnam is one of the few countries in Southeast Asia that still has quite a high vegetable consumption. Other countries like the Philippines are really close to not eating vegetables and fruits, and it's very not optimal. So I think those trends, they will just continue, except if you do not have a major price crisis, price volatility, because that can always bring shifts, and we have seen that in a couple of crises, be it economic crisis, so, or weather with the climate change. And I think maybe the climate change needs not to be underestimated, what it can influence in terms of long-term vision, in terms of consumption and shifts in consumption.
Yeah, it's an important point. I think there's something to learn from Asian diets in general. We've seen a contrast between a Western diet in some of the examples that I've shown previously and the Asian diet, which is typically more wholesome in terms of food density, of nutrition, and vegetables, and the communal aspect of food as well. So perhaps Asia has a huge role to play in terms of exporting a better food culture, a healthier food culture.
Tony, perhaps if I could respond to that. I think you're absolutely right. In terms of food culture, I think Asia, where it stands, has an enormous opportunity in terms of leading the debate on obesity as well. I think what Regina said, there is definitely some changes in trends in Asia to different types of food and more meat consumption, perhaps even convenience foods as well. But on the whole, diets in Asia compared with, say, North America or Europe, they are different, and you might argue in some ways that they are more healthier as well. So I think if you look at that, you look at the Asian phenotype, the type of Asian here, and the type of research that can be done to teach the rest of the world what different foods are appropriate for certain different types of people all over the world, I think that has a huge benefit to the research that's being done on obesity. It's not simply just taking a Western model of what a diet is and applying it in Asia. I actually think Asia can do the research and apply that to the West. And as for changing lifestyles and things, I actually would like to sort of look at the process, certainly coming from Singapore, coming from a big city or other big cities in Asia. I think it's really absolutely critical that maybe schools, we go back to teaching basic human nutrition again. I feel like certainly in some of the schools in Singapore, it's totally ignored. And I think that's absolutely fundamental, that you have to start with educating children about nutrition. And that's an important aspect that maybe, perhaps not in other countries, maybe it is done, but certainly in rapidly urbanizing centres, that needs to be addressed.
I think it's absolutely critical. I mean, the parents have a role as well. It's not that 4-year-olds, suddenly decide to choose something. I mean, they will choose what's put in front of them, and the parents have a role to educate as well. It's not just schools. Can Matt and Tina talk about how farmers and retailers can collaboratively measure the socio-economic environmental impact from farm to table? Let's repeat that. Could Matt and Tina please talk about how farmers and retailers can collaboratively measure the socio-economic and environmental impact of a farm to say table concept. Does that make sense? Have I interpreted that? Complex question.
I was going to say I'll have a go.
Have a go, yeah.
All right, so I think it a little bit builds on the themes that we've just been talking about. And I think the role of farmers and retailers working together is actually around raising the productivity of the farms in terms of the yield, and doing so in a way that is using the resources of that farm in a far more efficient way, doing so in a way that is using products that are registered and are therefore not going to have a detrimental impact either on the environment or in terms of MRLs that are left in the food, and doing so in a way that is actually bringing economic benefit to the communities in which they serve. And I think that is possibly one of the more challenging aspects of what we need to do. If I reflect on a very nice partnership that I've seen when I was traveling in the Philippines a few months ago, was actually around retailers and farmers working together in looking at how they could raise the productivity of corn. And some very practical steps, which was not about using more, it was about using and working the farm in a more efficient way. So right from tilling the land, so how do you till the land in a way that sets it up such that the crop is most likely to germinate and have a very good opportunity to establish itself. Practice in the Philippines would be only 2 plows in order to prepare and till the land. But actually, if you do one additional plow, then you're actually going to get a far more uniform growing bed, so you're going to have much better and uniform germination. So that was point number one. So that was a management practice through education that could make a difference. The second then is, of course, the quality of the seed you put in the ground and how you protect that plant when it comes out. So how do you use technologies such as seed care, nutrition, and good water management to nurture that plant? And then how do you protect that plant over its growing cycle? And that's not, again, about using more. What we've demonstrated is we can take 2 or 3 sprays out of a production system, but again, by using good and modern technologies at the right time. The farmers' yields went from around 6 tons to 10 tons just by changing those key practices. And I think that then revolves back to social and economic and environmental impact about doing things better to get a better result, both for the grower, for the retailer, and for the communities that they serve. So I think these are some of the things that we should be and can be replicating through multi-stakeholder partnerships to get even greater value.
And I think that's a wonderful example of operationalising the triple bottom line in a practical sense at a farm level. So thank you for that indeed. Do you think certification and traceability can be a solution for food safety? Who would like to? Certification and traceability can be a solution for food safety. Would you like to take a go at that one?
I believe that in Hanoi today, people, the customer in Hanoi is very concerned about the food safety. I think everybody here know about Điện Biên Phủ, the very successful campaign during the French War before. But maybe not many people from outside know that in Điện Biên Phủ also is a very good rice field of Vietnam. And the people in Hanoi love the rice come from Điện Biên Phủ. And I think 100% of the rice grown by Điện Biên Phủ rice field is transferred to sell in Hanoi. But it's not enough. So many people try to bring rice from different regions, come to Điện Biên Phủ, pack there and sell it back to Hanoi in the name of Điện Biên Phủ rice. And of course it is harmful for both the producer and customer. But it also is raising the issue that we lack of distribution system or retail system reliable enough to persuade traceability and have a not only good standard of production but also good labeling tracking system to ensure that whatever we eating here is whatever is right in the label, in the label.
Yeah.
So I think everybody here believes about that. That if we have good traceability system, if we have good retail system, the price of agricultural production can raise, and it benefit both producer and customer.
Thank you.
Could I just add
Yeah.
on that? Just to supplement on what Dr. Son said, I do think that those are important, but I also think that we need to focus as well on farm level production and ensuring that at the farm level there is a recognition and an understanding of the dangers associated with bad agricultural production. One. The other is on behavior change on the part of consumers. I think that because in a sense, if we only focus on traceability and certification, in a sense we're passing the responsibility solely to the government, to the public sector. But I think, as I think others have said it here, we as consumers have a responsibility to ask the questions, to push. But at the same time, we need to make sure that at the farm level as well, there is an understanding, because I do believe that lots of times there's unfair blame put on farmers because simply they are not aware, or the products that are coming in to be used as fertilizers or pesticides, etc., have chemicals that they are unaware of. So there's a need for it to be done through a sort of a multifaceted approach.
Absolutely. I mean, I've seen this work in practice with my father when I left the farm. You know, talking about tillage, he would drive a tractor over and over and over to kill the weeds. I mean, sometimes 6, 7 times. Then I returned sort of 30 years later and I said, wow, you know, what's this interesting machine? And he said, it's just, we go over once. It's direct till. You know, so it's just, in some ways, it's an evolution. It's an education. He just didn't have the knowledge at that particular point in time. So the efficiency comes through as well. So he's far more productive, or was far more productive than ever before. But it's getting that knowledge onto the ground that's often the challenge.
I think it's also the research and development by the industry. It's
Yep.
also really, really key, because a number of these practices just didn't exist 30 years ago. So the investment that's been made by the industry and multi-stakeholders, partnerships, in looking at new and better ways is, for me, one of the key learnings from what that example that you just shared.
Yeah, there's an interesting question that's just come through. So we talked a lot about production and increasing yields. What about reducing food waste? I mean, we throw a lot of what we produce, and I can, you know, speak definitely from the North American perspective, where 2/3 of the food that's produced is thrown out. What can we do, Regina, in this space? Is it education? Is it working with corporations? How can we manage this issue of food wastage?
Well, I think I will just maybe answer partly to it, and then I will pass it on to my panelists, because the food waste is occurring at different stages through the value chain. And there is, of course, right after harvest, there's a lot of food waste. And I think my colleagues at the panel, they can actually talk to this, because I do think innovation and better agricultural practices and storages, etc., can really help that. But then what we also see, of course, is the food waste at the consumer end, you know. Again, here I just would like to say that my organization, GAIN, we are working with a consumer part that actually is very poor. So the food waste issue that you see, or when you go and see the next morning maybe all the garbage that is there, that's a discussion that actually goes for the middle class higher up. But what touches on the poor as well is, if there is not a possibility to store the food properly, then of course there comes food waste, which actually then touches on food safety. So I think food waste has a lot of, you know, facets and a lot of entry points to do something. But I think some of my panelists, they can actually better talk to this. Please.
Tina, yeah, yep, Tina.
Yeah, I think where we see food waste most predominant is in perishable foods in particular. And so from a Syngenta perspective, what we're trying to do particularly in markets like India, and let's take the tomatoes as one of the key perishable foods that's so important in the Indian diet. We need to breed a tomato that's nutritious, that's flavoursome, and that's robust enough to be transported. Yeah? And if we have those three criteria in place, which we do, then we can actually help the farmers to to produce a great harvest, and something that the consumer wants to buy, and that when it actually arrives on their plate, it's something they'd like to eat, because actually the thickness of the skin and the composition of the tomato is such that it has been able to be transported many, many kilometres across Indian roads. So I think there is a role for industry and companies like Syngenta to think about how do we do that more routinely across the perishable food space, is the very pragmatic contribution we can make to this challenge.
Thank you, Tina. Matt, what about the role of food labelling? I mean, is there an increased role? I mean, certified organic is the sort of big thing at the moment, but greater transparency in food labelling so that the consumer actually knows what they're getting in their food product.
Well, I might address that from the nutrition aspect.
Yeah.
I mean, there are many different systems that can be applied to this on front of pack or back of pack, and I think from the industry perspective, it's always looking at giving consumers fact-based and science-based information in a clear and legible way. I know that that can be a little bit of a challenge for some consumers, obviously, if you're not educated in what sort of nutrients are and stuff. So from the industry perspective, we would support sort of like guideline daily amounts, or what they call GDA monochromes, which have been applied across parts of the world. And I know other parts of the world have different systems as well. There's traffic light systems to give people information. I think in Australia there's a health star system as well. So all these are valid, but I mean, the question is how much information we give to consumers and what they do with it as well. It's not just simply giving them information on labelling, but it's trying to teach them and make them understand what this information means too. Because there's a lot of misinformation out there about nutrition labelling.
Yeah.
So I think from the industry perspective, we will always advocate for a science-based and evidence-based nutrition labelling on food.
Absolutely. Thanks, Matt. Look, I think we're going to need to wrap up at that, unless there is any pressing question from the audience that someone needs to absolutely ask. So we've got one in the front here. Could we get a microphone? We'll take one final question, then we'll wrap up and thank the panel and conclude for the day.
Thank you. Stephen Browning from the Green Party, Aotearoa, New Zealand. I've heard... It's working? Good. I've heard a number of things here, and I hear from Syngenta about their tools. But on the other hand, we are very busy burying people from cancers. We've got endocrine disruptors and whatever. And I'm really concerned that these so-called tools are genuinely not sustainable for mankind anymore. We have other systems. I haven't heard the word agroecology mentioned here, which is something that we should really be looking at in terms of sustainability. The food industry, with its labelling. Consumers want good labelling. This is one around genetic engineering and labelling it. The science you mentioned. What science? Where's the genuinely independent science? These are the questions I would like, and particularly people like the World Bank, when they're going out, to make sure that these questions are being addressed very, very deeply. Thank you.
Thank you. Nathan, and thank you for your question. I mean, it's important to raise these issues. Would you like to make an attempt in 1 minute? I know it's not a lot of time, but perhaps we can connect you afterwards to follow up with a more detailed discussion.
Look, I mean, I don't think any of us would disagree with what you've said. I think that this is, and unfortunately we just didn't have time to go into details, but the broader health issues related to agricultural production systems, agroecological systems, and how we work through them. I mean, we talked about it we keep talking about nutrition, but I think nutrition is directly interlinked with health. And we keep, and I think Tina also kept on talking about the research dimension of this. I mean, I don't think that we in the CGIAR system, for example, in the agricultural research system or in the national agricultural research systems, that there has been, particularly in the developing world, that much research on the health side of agricultural production, naturally because everyone's thinking about increasing yields, productivity, and we've lost sight of the other aspects. In some of in the OECD countries, even in countries like China and Vietnam, agricultural pollution is becoming a very focused issue. They're very keen to understand what is happening in terms of soil contaminants, et cetera. So I think your point is very well taken. I don't think this is why it's a complex issue. This issue that we're discussing, it's not just about getting more yields up to feed more people. It's centrally as well on the safety, nutrition, and health aspects as well. So thank you for raising that point, and it's certainly a message that I think all of us would agree that we need to continuously raise with our different stakeholders.
Thank you, Nathan. With that, we'll wrap up. Please thank Dr. Song, Nathan, Tina, Matt, and Regina for their inputs. Thank you, panel.